Okay, and we are live. Today we have Jim Casey. How are you doing today, Jim?
Hey, how you doing?
All right, now I had you on the show before and we had a great interview. I'm really thrilled with it. But I somehow overlooked the fact that you've dealt with certain terrorism like Antifa and neo-Nazis, things like that. And you wrote an article for The Hill and you were talking about the recent violence that's been going on. So to clarify, not the protests, but the riots and the looting, you feel like you know who is involved or what the cause may be. Can you go into that?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. And I'd preface all these comments with it's complicated and there's no easy answer. There's no single, one size fits all answer. It's really a complicated scenario. Um, I think to the extent that we're talking about the violence, the majority of the violence, the breaking out of all the store windows in New York and Manhattan,
Mhm.
setting police cars on fire. I mean, those are clearly agitators. Anarchists is really the best word for it. They're just out
Mhm.
there for the violence and, to cause trouble. I separate them wholly from the protesters. There are people that
Right.
feel like they had a legitimate gripe with the government, whether it's the government in Minnesota, Minneapolis, New
Mhm.
York, Washington, D.C., Seattle, wherever. First Amendment right is there, and people can peaceably protest, and they should. But intermixed in there are these anarchists. We're referring to them now as Antifa. That's kind of a new phrase. Anarchy
Mhm.
is not new. What these guys have been doing for 100 years is not new. You can go back to the 1930s. There were anarchists that were sort of affiliated with the Communist Party. You
Sure.
can go to the 60s and 70s where you really saw this kind of ramp up with the Weather Underground, the
Yeah,
Black
I was going to ask
Panthers.
you about Bill Ayers because Bill
Correct.
Ayers is still around. Bill Ayers
Right.
is still kind of talking to different people. Is he involved with the Antifa? I mean, is this just a renaming? Because I understood Antifa as existing literally as long as fascism, but just kind of, I don't know, another leopard without its spots.
Yeah, I didn't hear it officially referred to as Antifa a lot until after Charlottesville. That seemed to be when that moniker really was attached to the anti-fascist or the anarchist groups. And I think, at least from my perspective, investigatively, and we'll go back to what I did, working against these
Mhm.
anarchy groups, and then compare and contrast them to working against neo Nazis because they were completely different. And that's what gives me this prism to say, here's what one does and here's what the other does, and it's pretty easy to see who's doing what. Um,
Mhm.
but you know, as I said, I never really heard them referred to as Antifa very much. It was just that you had the group that was at WTO in Seattle in 1999. It's
Mhm.
the same group. I mean, I don't know if they were called Antifa back then, but they were anarchists that were against capitalism. They were destroying Starbucks and other businesses because that's the way they got their message across. You move forward a little bit into the early 2000s, and you had the ALF. They're still around, but they were
What does
really
that
big.
stand for?
So they were the Animal Liberation Front and the Earth
Ah,
Liberation Front.
okay.
A lot
I
of these
had
are the same types of individuals that were in these groups. I'm
okay.
not saying they're the same individuals. In fact, I think a lot of these individuals age out of these groups. I said
Right.
on Fox News last week, some of them are probably the kids or the grandkids of some of these other incidents we watched. So
Mhm.
Antifa is kind of a new moniker that everybody's talking about now. The anarchists per se are not. I mean, they've been around for a while.
Okay, let's go into the other side for a minute. You went into a little bit of history of neo Nazis in the article, and I guess you were saying they sort of stem out of the KKK if we go way, way, way back. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
I'd share my experience in working against both these groups at the same time. It was in the late 90s and then, probably the
Mhm.
first several years of the 2000s until around 2003, 2004. And I was in a Midwestern field office. I won't say where, and I haven't said where because I think that, some of these groups may still be around and the FBI may be working them, and there's no reason to flag where this is. But, with the neo Nazis and right before them, there were, you know, these militia groups that you heard about, and this was before Oklahoma City. Militia groups kind of lost their shine a little bit because I think people were anti-government and thought that the overreaching of the federal government needed to be dealt with. But once they saw what happened in Oklahoma City, many of the militias were just not. They weren't down with that. They were not about killing innocent people and little children and things like that. They were all for the free beer and the firearms training on Saturday morning, but that's where it ended.
So that was Ruby Ridge into Waco,
correct,
into Oklahoma City bombing. Now,
correct.
Is it true that a lot of this is tied to the Turner Diaries?
I think the militia groups were, and I would separate the militia groups from the neo-Nazis and the KKK and those groups. None of this. I'm not saying that they're always separate and apart. Nobody ever belonged to both. I'm talking very generally that you have these, militia groups that, as you point out, were right after Ruby Ridge, Waco, and there was that movement that the federal government was too powerful; they needed to be dealt with. And then I saw a real demarcation when Oklahoma City started. That many of those groups said, "No, this is not what we're about." And some of them kind of went away. It certainly lost membership. Neo-Nazis a little different. The Hammerskins, the nationalist groups. Those are the ones that still exist, and they're still somehow affiliated, or many of the members are affiliated with the KKK. And what I saw with them, and what I was talking about in the article, was that they sort of show their colors. They go and pull permits to do a protest. Now, it's not because they're so law-abiding that they want to pull a permit. They're projecting what they're going to do. They're sort of inviting, counter-protesters and the police to come, and then, potentially, get violent with them and create an incident. So just the fact that they pull a permit doesn't make them good guys.
I heard a rumor that you could fit all of them in like one church, but there's not that many.
There's probably not. I'll tell you how they are like the groups we're calling Antifa. They're very all over the place. They're very bifurcated. A group of Hammerskins in Michigan, for example, probably don't know or have much to do with Hammerskins in Arizona. So
what are Hammerskins? I'm sorry.
It's a club. It's a white nationalist, white supremacist organization, like the Aryan Brotherhood. That's sort of a well-known that emanated out of the prisons in California, and people, you could literally join them. And it's easier, generally it's easier to join some of these white nationalists hate groups than it is to join Antifa, because that's the way Antifa insulates itself from law enforcement, the rest of the community, and things like that. In fact, we tried to infiltrate in the Midwest when I was working both of these groups at the same time, which gave me this optic of the neo-Nazis on the one side and the anarchists on the other. Excuse me. We would literally go knock on the door of people we knew who were neo-Nazis and have conversations with them. Again, not because they're good guys, but because we wanted to get information with them. And some of them felt like they weren't doing anything wrong, so they would share information with you. Some of them we were able to develop as sources so that we knew what was going on, and they were literally sources of the FBI. Antifa.
What was that like, by the way? I mean, I'm sure that you weren't really in love with hanging out with them and going having drinks or whatever. How do you develop a source and not be, I hate to use the term, skeezed out, but creeped out by their behavior?
Well, you just separate the fact of what you have a job to do here. It's like, interviewing a child molester. You don't have to, part of interview and interrogation is developing rapport and understanding. And, if you go in and slam your fist on the desk and talk about how terrible child molesting is, you're probably not going to get much out of this guy.
Oh, you mean TV doesn't work? That's not true?
No, it doesn't.
Oh.
It takes a lot longer too. But the same thing with these guys, you have a conversation about what they're, what motivates them, and, sort of develop some sort of a rapport and give them a reason to give you information. And, there's this exchange that goes back and forth, and it, becomes a relationship. It's sources and law enforcement officers have to coexist. But that didn't happen with the anarchists. You couldn't get into the groups. In fact, the story that I tell often is, we identified a leader, somebody who was, posed to become an undercover agent, went in, tried to join the group. And he was told, quite frankly, hey, thanks for your interest in the movement here. the way this works is you develop your own group. So you're now the leader of your own, they call it an affinity group.
Like
And so you
cells?
go out, I'm sorry?
Are they like cells?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Develop your own cell. And that, and then we'll see you do good things and maybe we'll get back with you. So, if you were out there with your own cell and you were engaging in, whatever anarchy behavior that they perceived as, down with the cause, then maybe they'd reach out to you and be part of a bigger organization, but generally not.
Interesting. So there's no like centralized thing. You can't be beaten in or whatever, like a gang. It's loose.
No, and I think that's where, frankly, a lot of us Americans struggle with that concept. We're used to, organization. We're used to, joining an organization and, knowing who the president of the organization is and maybe getting a membership card. Even, Al Qaeda and ISIS, there was a little bit of command and control at the top of those organizations, but overwhelmingly, most of the Al Qaeda fighters and terrorists, they're self-radicalized. They didn't know bin Laden. They didn't know KSM. They didn't know Zawahiri. I mean, those guys were kind of at the top of the organization, calling the shots, fundraising, and things like that. But the overwhelming majority of the members were just loosely affiliated and operating on their own and carrying out the will of the organization. We've just turned it into sort of this. It's a well-structured organization, and if you take out the leaders, then the organization will go away, and that's not the case. And it's not the case with Antifa either.
Well, how do they know what to do? Do they just have general ideas like, okay, if it's capitalism, it's bad, do anything you can to destroy it? I mean, I'm curious, how do they determine what is good, what is bad, what they want to do?
Well, I think they are, for the most part, very, socialism related. They, I like to say they don't really know what they want. They know what they don't want. They don't want status quo. They don't want capitalism. They don't want corporations. So if you can get rid of those three things, maybe something better will percolate up, and it often looks like utopia. It often looks like what we see in, classic Marxism and Leninism, that, the workers will own the means of production. There won't be evil corporations and capitalism that are oppressing people.
So it's more class warfare than necessarily like racial or anything else.
I think so. I mean, I do believe, they've adopted this anti-fascist, and I've had people, tweet back at me, well, if you're against Antifa, then you're a fascist. It's one or the other. You have to be pro-fascist or anti-fascist. Do I know that every little 19-year-old that's in Manhattan breaking out windows is a racist or not a racist? I have no idea. I have no idea what's in his heart. But if he says he's not a racist, good for him. But that doesn't mean breaking out all these windows and trying to destroy businesses and capitalism is a good thing either.
That's something I heard, and I guess it bears exploring too. All this destruction doesn't necessarily have to be a lot of people. Like a crew of 3 or 4 people could just tear up an entire downtown relatively quickly, couldn't they?
Yeah. So, and some of the tactics we saw that I've seen in both New York and Washington D.C. I know a little less about Seattle, but you can see what's going on out there. That there's a lot, and that's sort of the birthplace of this. Quite frankly, there's a lot of this activity in the Seattle area. But what I saw in New York and Washington D.C., you see these guys, and you can see this on Twitter. If you look for it and look for videos, you can see guys that look like kind of field commanders, and they're not necessarily dressed in the black hoods like the little worker bees are, but they're kind of directing traffic, and they're talking to people, and you can even see them passing out money. Giving somebody, rolled up bills or, some leaflets or something like that, and pointing, go here, go there. And then you also see the bicycles. What these bicycles do is deploy and get ahead of the crowd. And what they do is they're kind of scouts. They go and find out where the police aren't. So, if the police are on Fifth Avenue or whatever, they'll skip over a couple blocks, get on Twitter or their phones and call back to the field commander and say, okay, come on up to Fifth Avenue. There's no police here. So they make their way up there with these smaller gangs and start destroying things because there's nobody there. And then they move on.
Right. And so smash some windows, grab some stuff, light a fire can create a huge amount of damage pretty quickly.
Right.
Folks who are watching, make sure you ask questions in the chat. We definitely are here for that. I do want to ask you, though, I've heard a lot about it. What about these pallets of bricks? Have you heard about that?
I have. And again, I have no inside information on this. I talked to some people. Actually, some of my best information has come from, former CIA analysts who kind of looking at this and doing some analysis, and all of us are just kind of former.
Why CIA though? I'm curious about that.
Because they're good analysts. I mean, there are a lot of analysts out there, and you can find them who really were, have analytical minds and know how to break things down and know how to go on websites and things and find information. Look at open source information. And what I've seen, the best analysis I've seen is that the pallets that you have seen where people are like breaking away the straps or whatever, holding it on. Almost all of those were there for construction, either road construction or putting up a building or something like that. However, especially in New York, I've seen, I think, pretty credible evidence of tubs, like Tupperware tubs, those big Tupperware tubs that are full of bricks and rocks that have been strategically deployed. Now, that's not for construction. No construction company, deploys Tupperware bricks. So I think those were, strategically part of the plan to do destruction.
Okay, yeah, I was wondering about that. And who would fund that? Well, I guess a smaller group could put that together then. It doesn't really have to be.
All terrorist operations, even 9/11. I mean, trying to think back of what the final tally was. If you go back to the 9/11 report, that, it cost them to put the whole thing together, less than $100,000. Look what kind of damage they did. We're still talking about it. These operations are not expensive. They're just really not. And, the sort of funding that we hear about, from, figureheads that, kind of controlling the world. I don't buy into those kind of conspiracy theories, but I do think that, they probably have benefactors and people that are willing to donate money that makes its way down to the operations.
Okay, I've got some comments here from St. Michael. Cheers from Canada, your next UN state. I'm not sure what that is. The FBI facilitated terrorist activities to swoop in and be heroes, sometimes too late. I don't know if that's I'm not sure where that one's going. And then what does it take for the FBI to activate in Seattle? And that actually leads into a question I had myself, that I'm guessing that the police are aware that things are going on, that there are agitators, and I'm guessing that they're not just laying back on their laurels saying, oh, well, they tore down the city. There's probably some active investigations going on. Would that be a fair statement?
I think so. As we talked about a little bit earlier, they've been dealing with this for a long time. I mean, 1999 was the WTO, World Trade Organization. There was supposed to be a conference there, and these groups didn't want them there, and they created a lot of havoc. So they know who they are. They've been working against them for a long time. That said, I mean, I did see recently, this afternoon, that the chief of police put out a statement basically to her troops saying it was not my decision to give up the precinct. This was made, by the city. So there's politics involved, and then the politicians, I mean, and look, they report to the people, right? You elect your city commissioners, your mayors, and then they appoint police chiefs. And so the will of the people is seemingly being done through these political maturations, and as it should be. So to your point, I think they know what they want to do. They know what they can do. They know what their capabilities are. And at what point they could probably go in there and, as safely as possible, take back that precinct. But that's just something they have to work through. It's hard for me to say when that should happen. I mean, I personally don't believe they should have given it up, but that's, I'm not there, I'm not on the ground, but I don't think that you kind of cede territory to terrorists, and that's what this is. I mean, the classic definition of terrorism is, the use or threatened use of violence against a civilian population to achieve a political gain. Telling the police that, you're going to cause damage and violence if they don't get out of the precinct, and then you occupy it and call it no longer part of the United States, sure sounds like terrorism to me.
I agree. Now, obviously, you're not in the FBI right now. You were in the FBI several years ago. So everything here is pure hypothetical and speculation. But in your FBI as a special agent in charge or working terrorism, what is a probable action you would be taking right now if you were in one of these cities, say like Dallas? We'll just name a city that's not one of the others. What would you be doing right now? Would you be out there trying to collect some evidence, talking to people to build a case of some kind?
So, all of these cities have highly competent, highly trained, highly educated police officials.
Mhm.
And they are the first line to, stop violence, to work the problem. Where the FBI could contribute to this in real time is to have sources of information. I mean, this is not something they would go out and start looking for sources. We use Dallas as an example. Hopefully, agents on the counterterrorism squad there would have sources of information in the community that they could reach back and talk to and say, okay, you know, tell me what you know about what's going on downtown. What's going on with the occupation of the police department? Who's in charge? Who's likely in charge? Point me to, some information that we can work with. That would be the first thing they would be involved in. I think secondarily, they'd be there for their partners from, Dallas PD, using this example, and, probably could have some tactical resources if needed. Most of these departments don't need tactical resources. They have, really good resources themselves.
Okay. And could you help on the electronics front? Perhaps I believe that Antifa tends to communicate through different apps and phones, different things like that. I didn't know if
Sure.
that was something that sometimes the FBI did.
Yeah. No. So absolutely, that could be certainly be of assistance. Domestically, it's a Title III, which is a criminal wiretap, the old wiretap like you do against the mafia or something like that, as opposed to the FISA, which we've heard so much about, which would be used against a foreign organization. So if we don't believe that these individuals, to use the mythical Dallas scenario, that they're foreign terrorists, then yeah, certainly the FBI could get classic wiretap authority against people that they have probable cause to believe are involved, to grab information from cell phones, text messages, and things like that. Absolutely.
And I don't know if RICO would be the thing, but if there's a conspiracy or something working together, could you also seize assets and money and transfers and different things if you could find a funding?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely other criminal activity that could be charged, but it could be charged by, in the Dallas case, against Texas law, against the
Okay.
Texas statutes, to occupy buildings against police orders, to have weapons unauthorized, to I'm even heard in Seattle. I don't know if you've seen this, that they control this 6 block area. They're now extorting the businesses that are within that 6 block area. They're asking for taxes, and that's called extortion. It's against
Which
the law.
really troubles me because we're going to be leading into your second article, but the people who are affected most by this are the people who are protesting because they are hurt
Correct.
quite often. And that it breaks my heart. I'm going to jump out. I see some questions starting to roll in, so I want to tackle these. JLW asks, how does Jim avoid running up against severely dangerous people in his line of work, i.e., highly powered political types with criminal motivations?
Um, I don't. I just never ran up against anybody that was highly powered and political that I considered to be dangerous. Politicians have their own motives. It's usually a political motive. It's not criminal. So the question, it looks like you're combining a powerful political type with criminal motivation. So I just don't. I never had that challenge.
Is it also possible that somebody who would become highly powerful probably couldn't be overly criminal because they would get tripped up on their way?
Yeah, I mean, most politicians that I've seen that get involved in criminal activity, it's highly personal, and it's highly financial. So it's things like bidding, bid rigging, lining their pockets personally. That's not a problem for an individual FBI agent. Certainly not a dangerous situation generally.
Fair enough.
Never say never.
Well, there you go. And it could be coming up now. I mean, who knows? Ronan Shanley asks, what are the laws on the books when it comes to designating groups domestic terrorists?
So that's a great question. First of all, they have to be highly identifiable. So I mentioned too, the Aryan Brotherhood and the Hammerskins. There's a lot of information about them. There's a lot of data on them. They can be designated. You know that they're a terrorist group because they tell you who they are. Again, for the purposes of investigating them and prosecuting them, there's no domestic terrorism statute. They're not charged with being domestic terrorists. They're being charged with weapons charges, explosives charges, violent activity, any number of criminal acts that they're violating in the name of doing domestic terrorism events. So there's no law against domestic terrorism per se, no federal law against domestic terrorism in the United States.
So it's like you can march and be a Nazi all you want, but if you burn a Jewish bakery, you've committed a crime.
Correct. Arson.
So is that essentially what you're saying?
Correct. And that can be a federal crime. Arson can be federal. So there you go. There's what they've done wrong, and that's what they get prosecuted for.
Okay. And it can also be further a hate crime. And St. Michael's asking, Antifa designated terrorist org by the president. So, and I think that's a good question. So they're designated a terrorist organization. What does that mean? Is it free up budget for investigations? Does it do nothing?
No, I mean, domestically, there are no designated terrorist organizations. That's something the State Department does. So, for example, Al-Qaeda, Hamas, Hezbollah, ISIS, those are all organizations that the United States Department of State has designated as terrorist organizations. They more recently, I should say, there was a white nationalist group actually based in Russia, which has a presence in the United States, that they designated. I should have done my homework a little better, and I'd be able to tell you the name of it. I forget. It really emerged since I've left the FBI. So I think, not being critical of the president, in this case, saying that Antifa needs to be designated as a terrorist group, there's really not a mechanism right now to do that, because the U.S. Department of State would not designate a domestic group as a terrorist. You can call them that. He and you and I and the caller are all free to say Antifa is a terrorist group. And so we're sort of designating it that, but officially they're not.
What would you call them then?
Well, I think you can call them a terrorist group, but the official designation that gives the federal government the power to charge somebody with financing a terrorist group, that comes from financing a foreign terrorist group, not a domestic terrorist group.
Okay. So you would have to really lean in on criminal conspiracy and that kind of thing.
Correct.
The whole way.
Correct.
Okay, great. I wanted to ask you about another group too. They get thrown in quite a lot, and I want to be fair because it's kind of a left-wing, right-wing, back and forth type of thing. The Proud Boys. Do you have any thoughts on them? That's Gavin McInnes's group, which supposedly was created as a joke, but maybe has grown into.
Yeah, I confess that I don't really know that much about him. I really don't. I should look that up when we're done. I don't know not much about him.
I have a habit of doing that to you.
That's okay.
All right. Well, in your current job working security, what kind of clients do you have? I have a question from JLW.
So, the majority of the clients that we serve are people who need sort of high-end investigations, attorneys, litigation support, deep background investigations. The organization I'm affiliated with now, previously we've done, some serious death investigations where there was maybe the family didn't believe that the police or the coroner had the right cause of death. We've done investigations for police departments to sort of review their investigation, that sort of thing.
I've talked to a PI who really specializes in that, and also a psychiatrist, and she said that there seems to be a lot of cases of suicides that really maybe aren't. Is that the kind of thing that you sometimes look into?
We have looked into a situation like that, and that's probably one of the hardest ones to figure out. The police do the right thing every time and look at a suicide as a homicide when they respond, and then work it backwards. So prove that it's not a suicide is the best way, for a police response, and they all do that. But at the end of the day, I'm sure there are any number of cases that just don't know.
Okay. I was wondering, why they might slip through? Is it just being overburdened, and sometimes they're trying to use Occam's razor, the simplest solution, and you move on?
I think it's because there's no evidence to the contrary. I can tell you, for example, I did an investigation. I won't name the client too much, but there was a law enforcement agency, and a girlfriend of a police officer. They lived together. She killed herself using the police officer's gun, and He was supposedly in the garage when this happened. He heard the gun go off, came in, found her almost dead, called the dispatch, had resources dispatched right away. And the cause of death was ruled by two different coroners to be suicide. Well, family members didn't buy that. They thought that the officer was involved in this. There's no evidence he was involved in it. Look, there were only two people there at the time, and one of them's dead now, so you don't know. The evidence, as far as the coroner was concerned, was there was some evidence that she committed suicide. There was no evidence that he killed her. And there can be cases like that.
And the fact that he was a cop might have been problematic because he would understand evidentiary procedure.
I think it was because it was more like high profile that he was a police officer in the community, and that rather than just this happening to two civilians, it became a higher profile suicide.
Well, let me take advantage of that as an ugly segue into a more recent article of yours about defunding or literally dismantling police departments. And I believe you're not for it. And I'd love to talk to you about it and learn where you stand on it. And obviously bring in the comparison that keeps coming up of Camden, which may or may not be the exact same situation. I don't know. Could you go into what you wrote and your thoughts?
So, to say I'm against it is, an understatement. First of all, I don't think it's serious. There is no city of any size, community of any size in this country that could function for a day without a police department. There's just too many things that they're asked to do. And I think what a lot of people are defaulting to is, and I heard that a politician, I didn't say it, heard him say it, so I want to be clear. I heard the other day that a fairly prominent politician said something to the effect, I'm paraphrasing, every time there's a mental health issue, we send a guy with a gun. Every time there's a domestic violence issue, we send a guy with a gun. Why are we always sending a guy with a gun? Because that's who you got. 2:00 in the morning, there are not a lot of mental health experts on duty. There are not a lot of social workers or marriage counselors, anybody else. So the police kind of get stuck with everything else. Their everything else basket gets filled up pretty fast. So it's just not realistic or conceivable or in the realm of possibility that police departments are going to get disbanded in this country. So I think it's a silly notion to have. Now, let's talk about what they really probably mean. And some of them have walked back to, well, let's take money from the police and put it into other resources. That might work. I'm on record and have told people, I was working in a very forward-leaning modern police department 35 years ago. We had social workers that we tried to have. There were county social workers that we tried to have on every single shift so they could be deployed. And, when a situation came up, they weren't in every car, but you could call, to your neighboring beat and say, can you please respond with, a resource? And so they would respond. But most of the time that didn't alleviate the need for the police. Most of these situations were still dangerous. There's no social worker that I know of that wants to go into a house at 2:00 in the morning when a guy's just beaten his girlfriend nearly to death. You still need the police. So this isn't an either or situation. I also don't think most communities in this country think that their police are overfunded. Maybe there are some. Maybe people feel that way legitimately. Most of them are not. That's why their budgets are, they're asking for more money every year, not because they want to get new toys or, be able to have great salary increases. They're just trying to answer calls for service. I noted in my article that many of these departments are de facto, defunded already. There are over 5,000 openings for police officers in this country right now on Indeed.com. If you look at the bumper sticker of almost every major city police department in this country, it has the 1-800 number you can call to join. So, the police departments are not fat and, with all the resources they need right now. So I don't know how that defunding the police to shift resources, to other social services, mental health experts, drug abuse counselors. Those are all great things. Most of them don't work 24/7. Most of them don't want to be in a career where they respond to 24/7. So, I don't see that defunding the police is really going to do any good either.
Well, what do you think might help? I mean, I can definitely see, I feel like the police are put upon quite a lot, or, in a way they're being kicked around, but there are also problems. I mean, there are some bad cops. I think that I haven't heard of anybody who has watched that video that hasn't said, that was wrong.
That it was murder.
Yeah. And I actually kind of wonder if it might be personal because they did work in the same place and there's a possibility that they knew each other.
Yeah, that's all going to come out. I mean, I don't want to prejudge the case. I don't know anybody that wants to. I don't want to say that there's anything that could make that better than what it was. The old adage that once this guy's under control, the fight's over is true. I mean, even if it was personal. And here's the other thing. I went to the first of 3 police academies in 1981. We were taught to stay away from the carotid artery. You could use chokeholds in 1981, and we taught them in the FBI too, but it was considered use of deadly force. It's the same as shooting somebody. So if you're going to put somebody in a chokehold, and people confuse chokeholds with putting your arm around somebody's neck for the purpose of cutting off air, which is not what a chokehold is. It's putting the pressure on the carotid artery, which stops blood from flowing to the head, which causes the person to lose consciousness momentarily for the purposes of putting them in handcuffs. That's what a sleeper hold or chokehold is. And, I know they're passing legislation, even federally and in many states right now to outlaw the use of a chokehold. That's up to the politicians to do. I'm sure if a police officer was in danger of losing his life, and the classic argument would be, you're wrapped up with somebody and the individual either has a gun or is going for your gun. And so what are you going to do? You can't let go of them because you might lose the fight. Maybe that's the point where a chokehold gets employed because it's deadly force. That if you had another way to get to your gun because he's getting to your gun, you might shoot the person instead. It's the same use of force policy to save your life.
But the guy is on the ground in handcuffs, so obviously that's not the scenario.
The fight's over.
I mean,
there are other ways to keep him restrained. I mean, there were 4 of them there, and I think, without Monday morning quarterbacking, we saw somebody get killed and lose their life. Those 4 officers could have kept that guy down, handcuffed behind his back for whatever period of time they needed to, in my opinion.
Well, and on that note, things have come out that the main cop, Chauvin, I believe it is involved, had a pretty long record. This is not the first incident. There was something like 18 other incidents and complaints and things of that sort. Is there a mechanism, because you've been on both the administrative side and on the boots on the ground side, is there a way that this could be investigated? And where I'm going with this is I feel like the people who know who the bad cops are other cops. Cops know who's bad. Is there a way to maybe look and see who's asking for transfers and maybe, kind of collating data like that? Like, wow, it's funny. Everybody's asking for a transfer out of this department for some reason more than average, or these cops are complaining against another cop. Is there anything that could be done administratively that you could maybe help find these guys?
I used to say in the FBI when I started to move into executive management, everything good and everything bad that happened was a result of squad supervisors, which is the first level of supervision. So things were going wrong on a squad, bad agents on a squad. And I don't mean bad in this case. I mean just ineffective, not doing their jobs, things like that. There was a first line supervisor that wasn't doing their job. And I'd answer with the same thing, that if you have a department and there are bad cops, there are sergeants and lieutenants that know it. And it's their job as first line supervisors to figure that out and fix the problem and raise it to the, command level, majors, captains, deputy chiefs, whatever that structure looks like, and to fix the problem. So they know, and to your point about, cops that have multiple complaints, look, any cop can have a complaint against them. You arrest somebody, they don't like it, they write a letter to the chief saying you're an awful person, but then it gets
I'm sure most cops have it, and a lot of it's BS.
Absolutely. I don't think most of them have 17 complaints.
Exactly.
But,
exactly.
You can see, and they wouldn't all flush out, in your favor if you were a bad cop. Some of them are going to start to look like, well, wait a minute, you did beat on somebody that didn't deserve a beating, that sort of thing. There's a saying going around right now in the cop community that, nobody hates a bad cop more than a good cop. And that's true. So, well, I don't think they want to snitch out other cops. They know, and to your point, the supervisors are there to make sure the right thing happens. And that's the way these things should be handled.
Well, I feel like I feel like there is a problem, and something has to be done because I think it was Chris Rock who said it. He changed my mind a little bit. He was saying, "Yeah, there's only a few bad apples." He said, "But imagine they were airline pilots. You can't say, well, we only crash a few planes a year."
I heard that
similar.
quote, and I like Chris Rock. I think he's a funny guy. I think he's a smart guy too. But as soon as I heard that, and I think he said it not recently, but it's come back,
Yeah, it's several years
recently
old.
because of the obvious situation. I'm reminded that in 2015, a Germanwings airplane was flown into a mountain by a pilot who had significant mental health issues.
Mhm.
And so, does
And
that
the
mean all
Malaysian
pilots are
one,
bad? Absolutely not. Does it mean that pilots come from the same community of people that we come from? That's exactly what it means. I put in my article yesterday, I was quoting Sir Robert Peel, sort of the father of modern policing, London Metropolitan Police Department in the early 1800s. He had a phrase as part of his principle of policing that the police are the people and the people are the police. And what he meant by that was they can't be an occupying force. They have to be, civilian, citizen servants. And that, they put on their uniform and they're part of the police, and then they go home and they take it off and they're the people. Well,
good
the
point.
other side of that is they come to the police with all of the problems that the people have. They have mental health issues. They have chemical abuse issues. They have finance, relationship, spiritual. All those problems exist in police officers too, because they're people. Now, some of that gets screened out because, they take psychological tests, they have background investigations. So you hope that those sort of problems aren't at the same
Sure.
level as many of the general population. But the fact is they're people, and they have to live and breathe and have the same problems, but they can't have those problems at work.
Yeah, and I guess it goes back to me. I just think that somehow there's got to be a way, and I'm not that smart, but cops know who the bad cops are, and they've got to clean it. They've got to do it themselves. I don't think we can't just sweep in and say defund them all or do this or do that. I'm hoping that they can.
Part of what we're seeing here, Eric, though, is there's a lot of video that's starting to surface right now of police officers behaving badly in stressful riot situations, and I'm not
Right.
condoning that whatsoever. Some of it,
Right.
I mean, they clearly aren't thinking straight because most of these cops are young enough to have grown up with cell phones. So it's not like when I was a cop and nobody could videotape you unless they had an 8mm or something like that.
Mhm.
So most of these cops, if they were thinking clearly, which they're clearly not, adrenaline is running, they're
Sure.
high in emotion, they probably haven't got much sleep because they're working 16-hour days, and they do something stupid like push a 75-year-old man or kick a girl who's sitting on the ground
Right.
unhandcuffed. But as abhorrent as that behavior is, and it is, this is what we're going to see in the media. They're not going to show the
Oh yeah.
675,000 officers who are doing the right thing every single day.
Right. And there's also, I mean, have you read up on the Milgram experiment?
I have not.
Okay, that one is Stanley Milgram. His parents were, I believe, in concentration camps in World War II, and he was going through the trials and saying, "Hey, everybody's saying I was following orders. I was following orders. I was following orders," and
Right.
he's like, in Nuremberg, that's what they were saying, and his thought was that can't be right because it's so obviously monstrous. How did this happen? So he conducted the experiment, which involved three people, a man in a lab coat who was a doctor representative, a student, and a teacher. And the test was actually on the teacher. And it would go where the people would walk in, and the student and the teacher would both come in as if they were both taking part of the experiment. The student was actually an actor.
Mm-hmm.
The doctor would say, "Hey, we're doing a test here for this student, and what I need you to do is whenever they get something wrong, you're going to give them a bit of a shock, so that way you know it." And they hooked up the pinchers to the fingers and showed there was a shock. Well, over time, they would keep saying the wrong answer, and they'd have to keep going at a higher and higher and higher and higher voltage until finally the student was screaming, "I have a heart condition," and then just complete silence.
Right.
And I forgot what it was, but it was a high percentage, like 69+%, who would just keep pressing the button.
This reminds me of sort of the psychology of mobs, right? People will do things in a mob that they would never do themselves because they just get caught up in the emotion of it. It becomes everybody doing it, not just me. And I think that sort of that mentality it can fester itself. And look, let's face it, in organizations like law enforcement where it's high stress, people are working difficult, shifts and things like that, they can start to look at themselves as different from the people. It's us versus them, civilians. I mean, cops always talk about civilians, because it's cops and civilians, and it, really shouldn't be that way. But human nature being what it is, it starts to become, sort of an us versus them.
Well, I was in the military. I was in the Army, and there's a militaristic vibe that comes across. And could that be part of it? Because I will say, I'm comfortable with cops, but some cops are so jacked up and armed up looking, I don't feel like they're representing me necessarily. They're wearing, almost like, booted up pants, like they're BDUs. And should we demilitarize them maybe a little bit?
It's an interesting conversation, and I would like to have had this conversation 2 years ago instead of now, because I don't look at that as the cause of what's going on. Again, I think we're seeing a lot of cops behaving badly because there's rioting and things going on, and the people are taking video and they see cops doing things badly. But to answer your question, I've been critical of the sort of militarization of the police. When I was a cop, we wore a tie 6 months out of the year. Now, is that comfortable to put a ballistics vest on and then a dress shirt and then a clip-on tie? No, but you're a professional. You're representing, the police department and the county that gave you authority, and you're responding to a citizen in a tie. I'm not a fan of seeing, all this armor and, sort of the 82nd Airborne look, because, for tactical teams, yes, absolutely.
Well, and sure, I understand that's too far. That's down the line.
Yeah. I would like to see it softened up a little bit, just generally to remind police and civilians that they're the same people.
Well, like I love bicycle cops. I feel like they're the most approachable people. No, I mean,
look how they're dressed, right?
Yeah, they don't feel threatening to me. They're wearing shorts. They're in the community. I feel like they're on the ground. They're able to see things at a slower speed because they're here. They feel approachable to me. And they have radios. They don't have to have a fast, so they can call for more. And I personally feel like maybe that's a little old fashioned, but cops used to be the same cops in the neighborhood, and everybody knew who their cops were.
Right. Look, quite frankly, I think you see a lot of it in I'll use New York as an example, Manhattan. I mean, there's a lot of foot patrol in Manhattan. There's an awful lot of officers who, are not in squad cars or, just moving around. They're on the street, walking, talking, and seem a lot more approachable than, an officer in a car with tinted windows that you only see roll up when something bad happens.
Okay, now I'm going to go through the comments here. It looks like they're having a conversation with themselves, which is awesome. I'm always thrilled with that. So rattling off, let me see. We've got largest gang in the world, has what we know as the wall of silence. I'm going to go a little on that. There's been some complaints about police unions perhaps being too protective at times. And I don't know if that's what they mean, but I'm going to hijack it and ask you about that.
So, I confess I don't have a lot of experience working with unions because the department I belonged to was in Virginia, and it was a right to work state. We had an FOP, but it was a bar. I mean, you didn't have, there was no collective bargaining whatsoever. I'll give you my personal opinion. I'm not a big fan of unions for public employees. I don't think you should be able to bargain with the taxpayers about your benefits or your salary, or certainly the ability to withhold your services from the taxpayer, because you're a public servant, not somebody who works for a corporation that you want to bargain with, and that you might even say to that company, if I don't get a certain level of compensation and benefits, I'm just not going to work for you today. That may shut down the line. That may stop production of commerce. I don't think we should have that in the schools and the police departments or anything else. So certainly, if there are, if unions are somehow a barrier to getting rid of good police officers who need to be getting rid of, then that's a debate worth having.
That was another thing you brought up, was the taxpayers. And as a taxpayer, I'm a little uncomfortable with the fact that if a cop goes unhitched, like that Chauvin, that they're going to get sued.
Mhm.
Guaranteed, Minneapolis is going to get sued. Who's going
100%.
to pay?
The
Well, it's going
taxpayer.
to be the taxpayer. Well, if my doctor screws up, at least they have to have malpractice insurance, or they are personally affected. I wonder if that isn't a problem. That you kind of have this weird safety net there. It's like, okay, well, you can mess up, but then the taxpayers cover it. It doesn't equate in my brain.
So we've heard the term qualified immunity, which is, I think, what we're talking about, and that means that public servants can't be sued in the course of their duties.
Mm-hmm.
I think, and I'll tell you for sure with the federal government, because that's where I worked the longest.
Sure.
When you got sued as an FBI agent, the first thing that the U.S. Attorney's Office and the FBI did was say, okay, is he in the scope of his employment? In other words, what that FBI agent did, is that what we were asking him to do? And if he made a mistake, well, that's one thing.
Right.
If he committed a crime, he's stepped out of the realm of being an FBI agent, and he's now in the realm of operating on his own. So,
Okay.
I'm sure that applies in Minnesota as well. I don't think that officer could in any way be judged to be operating under color of law that the state would agree with, so that he would have qualified immunity to murder somebody. But let's be real, police officers don't have a lot of money, so with the family going to sue him and get what? Not much. So they are going to sue
Right.
the department and the citizens and the state, and get money where they can.
Which again, yeah, and it becomes problematic. That's why I am wondering if there might not be a malpractice insurance or some sort of another way to do it to where there could be liability. Like, doctors have licenses and they can, get pulled and they can no longer practice medicine. So while their insurance may have to pay it or whatever, and they'll go after the doctor, I wonder if cops should have a license.
Well, they do.
Do they? Okay.
Yeah. I mean, I won't speak for every state, but I'd be willing to bet that every state requires a certification. So you have to, prove a certain level of education at a formal academy of some sort before you are authorized by the state, and that license can be yanked. Absolutely.
Okay. Well, that's good to hear.
Yeah.
All right. Some more we have in here. By the way, Eric, there's new body cam footage that just came out. I'm not familiar with it, so we'll have to look later. Are you familiar with that, Jim?
I've been hearing this for days, and I don't want to speculate. I mean, I hear what people say that this is going to change everything. I can't see anything that will change anything. Now, this may change the dynamics, and I'm wildly speculating with,
Sure.
And I don't understand Minnesota law. So the people that are saying, this should be second degree, third degree, first degree manslaughter, it's different in every state. So I'll leave that to people who are experts in the laws of Minnesota. Maybe there's different body cam footage changes that. I don't know.
I heard a lawyer talking about it. His name is Robert Barnes. He's a civil rights lawyer. On a friend of mine, David Freiheit. His show's called Viva Fry on YouTube. I encourage everybody to watch. He's a really smart guy, very balanced. But Robert Barnes is saying that he feels they are charging them with second degree murder instead of going higher because they want to get all four of the cops. That if they went first degree, well, they don't all have that as comfortably, and they would roll and two or three of them would be peeled off. But by going down slightly, they can go after all four. I don't know if that's true, but that's his speculation.
Again, I'm not a lawyer, certainly not a Minnesota lawyer. So, but, first degree does require, malice afore that. That means you had to go think about doing that he went to that, whatever Mr. Floyd was arrested, whatever that looked like. I don't know if he was in a store or something like that. But the officer said, I'm going there, and when I encounter him, I'm going to kill him. That's first degree murder. I mean, you have to have that sort of. Now, in law school, they'll teach you that, that malice aforethought only needs to be seconds. You don't have to think about it for a week.
So after 2 minutes, the remaining 9 minutes might have been covered by that first 2 minutes of forethought.
Right. But then, to prove it, you're really getting inside their head. Usually you prove it by the train of events that led to it, which clearly showed that they had that malice aforethought. So, other people speculate that they are charging high because you can always, in some states, again, don't know Minnesota, that you can charge high and then have the jury be instructed to find a lower level of guilt.
Right.
So,
as long as you charge all the levels,
correct.
And then they can choose they are.
Correct. Again, in some states, I have no idea in Minnesota what that looks like.
Okay. And this is why I love doing this and having the chat. JLW has been doing some research for me, and it appears Milgram experiment, after 300 volts, the student made no sound, and 50% went up to 450 volts. And 90% went up to 300 volts. So thank you, JLW. I'm guessing this is about the Milgram experiment.
A smart audience, Eric.
Hey, these guys are awesome.
Checking you. They know what they're doing.
All right. Well, so I want to go and wrap up with one last question. Wow, the time has gone by. What are your feelings on the investigation that went down to charge Flynn? Now, I know you don't know Flynn, but you understand the investigation. Is that normal from your experience?
No. I think that I've been saying to a lot of people, I've never known in the history of the FBI, certainly no case I ever investigated or supervised, but not any investigation I'm aware of where an individual was charged solely with lying to an FBI agent, 1001. So that in and of itself would have been unusual. I'm troubled, like other people are, by the evidence that existed that was never given to Flynn or his attorneys. I'm troubled by the fact that, a senior FBI agent wrote down, goal, get him fired, or get him to confess to the lie get him to lie for the purpose of prosecuting him for a lie. I mean, I would never go into an FBI interview and say, man, I hope this guy doesn't tell me the truth and that he lies and that I can catch him in the lie so I can prosecute him for the lie and not for whatever it is that matter of the fact that I went in to interview him for. So I am troubled by that. And then I'm troubled that that wasn't turned over to his attorneys. Frankly, I thought he got, pretty poor representation by the first group of attorneys that, pled this thing out without having all the evidence and not even having the transcript. I mean, an integral part of what he was charged with was saying something for which a transcript existed, for which his attorneys apparently didn't even have. So
well, that's the question too, right? It was on the record, everything he said. So it's not like he lied and deceived and they didn't know something. It just seems kind of odd. And
go back to Eric. I'm sorry to jump in here, but
Sure.
if you go back to, initially, former Director Comey said they didn't think he lied. And, this happened in February? He wasn't charged with 1001 lying to FBI agents until July or later after the Mueller team took over the prosecution. So there was no movement by anybody from the time it happened until much, much later for them to prosecute him for this. So I just think it was a stretch. I think that the Mueller team probably thought that he could cooperate more on this collusion that didn't exist. And so that's why they were interested in, squeezing him as an inducement to cooperate. He didn't know anything about collusion with Russia because it didn't exist, as we later found out now with the dossier being bogus and all that.
Also, was it not unusual for somebody in that high of a position to be approached directly? I mean, I would think that he would have a fleet of lawyers standing by going, why are you talking to him? What's going on here?
Well, the whole thing was unusual. I mean, you heard, I don't know if you've seen, probably have, the MSNBC clip with former Director Comey kind of joking with Nicole Wallace about it. I would send a couple guys over to the White House. I figured it was too, it was early enough. They don't know what's going on over there. Just send a couple guys over. Look, I worked in the White House as an FBI agent. I had the Riot Act read to me on day one by the counsel for the National Security Council. It said, okay, here's how transmission of information works between you here at the White House and your buddies back at the FBI. They don't pick up the phone and call you and ask you for information, and you don't pick up the phone and give them information or ask them for information. All goes through the White House counsel's office to create sort of this, we want the FBI to be nonpartisan, working for itself, not reaching into the White House asking for information. So everybody agrees. I think even the most, serious detractors of Flynn and what went on there, that protocol existed, and then it was breached by just sending agents over to the White House to interview the national security advisor inside the White House.
Okay, and I have somebody here asking about their previous question, and I apologize. Let me go scroll to it. If I can find it. I'm going to guess this is the question. Eric, in the FBI, has Jim ever filed a complaint against a fellow agent?
I fired other agents. How's that?
Okay.
And I defended them too. There were agents that were, recommended for discipline that I thought I knew the facts more than what had been, transmitted to the Office of Professional Responsibility and the entity in there that reviewed discipline and sent it back down. And I called on behalf of the agent and said, let's look at this again. Let's talk about why he did what he did and why the facts are, not the way it's being proposed in this discipline. But I've sent agents home. Yeah.
Okay. Well, that's perfect. That's definitely an answer. And I guess you obviously would know other FBI agents that reported fellow agents because you were an SAIC or SAC. Sorry.
Correct.
So
yeah. No, absolutely.
Okay. Well, we are actually out of time here, and I appreciate so much you coming on. I think everybody needs to look out for you on the Hill and follow you on Twitter, which I believe is Jim Casey _.
Jim _Casey_.
Okay, double underscore. I forget about that.
In there.
And you're going to post every article on there, right?
Correct.
As they come out, and you're also on LinkedIn as Jim Casey as
Correct.
well.
James Casey.
James Casey. Okay. Yeah. Well, Jim, thank you so much for coming on. And folks, if you like this, please subscribe. I have another Jim coming next week. This is going to be 2 weeks of FBI Jims.
There you go.
All right. Well, thank you so much.